The rich holdings of the MFA Boston's Monet collection give us the special opportunity to showcase the chronological breadth of his career. The Monet gallery within the exhibition features 3 decades and 4 places Monet worked, affording us a glimpse into several episodes of his artistic career. By the time of the first so-called Impressionist exhibition in Paris in 1874, Monet was 33 years old. He was married and had a 7-year-old son. The family lived in a rented home in Argenteuil, a suburb of Paris accessible in just 15 minutes by train. It was a place at once suburban and rural, as we can see in his meadow with poplars and his Boulevard Saint-Denis, Argenteuil in winter, both from 1875. At this time, the town was transforming from a small village to a Parisian commuter suburb. In Monet's painting of the Boulevard Saint-Denis in winter, the newly widened street, named in the title, curves through the center of the composition, populated by commuters holding umbrellas against the falling snow. To the left is the railway embankment, and at right, Monet's home, with peaked roof, balconies, and green shutters. It overlooks the snowy street and train tracks. This was the second house his family had rented in Argenteuil. The first was further down the street and just around the corner to the right, a stone's throw away. In the MFA's painting, there's a marvelous play of surface and depth, with the receding road pushing into the distance and the falling snow dotting the surface. We also find an extraordinarily subtle play of contrasting colors in the green fence and reddish-purple bare branches. What Monet saw right outside his home was, to him, worthy of art. Argenteuil also boasted more bucolic spaces, like the meadow with poplars, wherein we can imagine ourselves out in the countryside enjoying the sunshine and fresh air. Again, Monet's composition reflects his engagement in the 1870s with rendering air and depth. Contrasting red and green and purple and yellow, applied in bold impastos, seem to bring the foreground closer, while cool tones, more fluidly applied, convey the background's recession into hazy distance. The lively play of brushstrokes adds to a visual sensation of momentary observation and rapid rendering, while also giving the scene its own visual energy as well. We can sort of sense the breeze in the visual vibration of the paint. It is every bit a French Impressionist painting of the countryside in the mid-1870s, and also evokes broader, more generalized sensations of luminous meadows. This is a painting, an early representation of poppies, poplar trees, and in the distance, grain stacks, subjects to which Monet would return over and again throughout his career. While the small human figure does not take pride of place here, we know that Monet's friends regularly visited him and sometimes painted him in Argenteuil. Paintings by Monet and by Renoir, now in the Metropolitan Museum and the National Gallery of Art, were made in the backyard of Monet's first rental home in Argenteuil and given to Monet as gifts. Decades later, he recalled this day of painting in an interview. He described Renoir arriving while Monet was already painting, and Renoir asking Monet to borrow materials so he could paint as well. Monet watched Renoir paint and whispered to Monet, quote, "That boy has no talent. You're his friend. Tell him to give up painting," end quote. Monet thought this was all very funny, the teasing and jabbing between artists at work. Monet himself did not set up to paint next to Monet and Renoir to join them in painting this scene of his wife and son. You might notice he's busy yardening in the background of Monet's painting. Monet had painted side by side with Renoir in the late 1860s, perhaps most famously at La Grenouillère. But more and more, he preferred to paint on his own, which is not to say he didn't have guests, but that he didn't want to make painting itself a social or communal pursuit. Monet also painted Monet at work in the Argenteuil backyard garden, so we can see a little bit of the setup and get a sense for their solo projects. Clearly, they were looking in perpendicular directions, even painting in such close proximity to one another. It's instructive, I think, to see artists portraying their friends at work. In two paintings of Monet by Renoir, we can see the wide variety of colors on Monet's palette and the scale of his canvas on his easel as he works outdoors. Renoir observed, and I quote, "Without colors in tubes, there would be no Cézanne, no Monet, no Pissarro, and no Impressionism," end quote. An observation borne out in these paintings, myriad colors and change of venues, tubes being easy to transport, of course. It's helpful to imagine Monet set up with his wide array of colors and his portable easel as you're looking at the paintings he made and noticing the size of those works, whether he's working in his backyard or further afield. Much, much later in life, Monet said, quote, "I perhaps owe it to flowers that I became a painter," which always comes to mind for me when seeing paintings like Meadow with Poplars, and even more so, Camille Monet and Child in the Artist's Garden in Argenteuil. It was while living in Argenteuil that Monet had his first opportunity to plan a garden, and here he began to integrate his efforts as a gardener and a painter. The MFA's painting's setting is in the backyard of the house with green shutters, seen in the wintry painting of the Boulevard Saint-Denis. But we certainly couldn't determine that from this canvas alone with its close-up vantage point. Seeing the MFA's canvas side by side within the garden from a private collection helps to situate us in Monet's yard. The high perspective of In the Garden suggests the artist, and thus the viewer, looks down into the yard from a window or a staircase leading out of the house. For the MFA's painting, the artist and viewer are on the same level as the figures portrayed. In both, the circular path is evident, as is the dense row of flowers lining it. These have long been identified as roses, but recently suggested to perhaps be geraniums instead. In the MFA's painting, the riotous colors of those flowers frame a calm scene of Monet's wife, Camille, sewing with a small child at her feet. Monet used a wide range of lively strokes to depict the stripes of Camille's summer dress, the blades of grass beneath her, and the screen of petals behind her, lavishing equal care on each area so that the garden and figures capture equal visual attention. Here, the play of color and sense of space is quite different than that of the Meadow with Poplars. Here, Camille is in the artist's garden, and it has a push and pull of cool colors in the foreground receding and warm colors of the flowers advancing. It's a wonderfully alive composition with its brushstrokes and varied colors. It can be read as a pleasant sort of general image of a peaceful day in the yard without needing specific knowledge of who these people are. And the tight cropping makes the scene's specific location less immediately important or even evident without the help of Monet's biography and other works. It is at once specific and open. The child is too young to be Jean, born in 1867 and featured in the paintings we saw moments ago by Renoir and Monet. The couple's second son, Michel, was not born until 1878. So this little one remains unidentified. There is a degree of likeness in the face, hairstyle, and even dress of the woman, as well as Monet's statement to the painting's first Boston-based owner that this was his first wife, Camille, in the painting. We can see similar garments and features again in other paintings by Monet, presumed to feature Camille, like the rounded flower bed in Detroit's collection. Monet's composition also resonates with a robust tradition of images of a woman seated in an enclosed garden, most often paintings of the Virgin Mary, that Monet would have known through visits to museums, galleries, and auctions, as well as in publications. It can be simultaneously specific and momentary, as well as broader in its evocativeness. When you're with the painting in person, you may notice that Monet has applied the paint rather differently in the face and hair than elsewhere. In the woman's face and hair, there's a longer, more delicate stroke that resembles Renoir's brushwork a bit. Perhaps it is a powerful reminder that these two artists were companions in this time, but also increasingly going their own ways. Which reminds me of an anecdote from the following decade when the two friends vacationed together on the French Riviera. It was not a working trip. And when Monet returned to Paris, he immediately planned to return to the Mediterranean coastline on a painting trip alone. He told his dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel, quote, "As much as it was agreeable to do the trip as a tourist with Renoir, it would be a nuisance for me to do a working trip together. I've always worked better in solitude and from my own impressions, so keep this secret until I tell you otherwise. Renoir, knowing that I'm about to leave, would no doubt be eager to come with me, which would be harmful for each of us. No doubt you'll agree with me." 2 weeks later, he followed up from the coastline, clarifying, quote, "I wrote to Renoir, and I'm not making my stay here a secret. I only wanted to come alone to be freer with my impressions. It is always bad for two people to work together," end quote. On this painting trip in 1884, Monet remarked that it took weeks for him to truly see the place and conceive of it on canvas, despite having been there before and determined that it would be a good venue to paint. He said, quote, "You need to live in a place for quite a while in order to paint it. You need to have worked laboriously to render it confidently," end quote. He complained about the walking, stating that his was a dog's life, and as he explored the landscape. As we can see in his 1884 painting, Cap Martin, near Menton, he found so much visual interest in the place, with its red earth here in thick impasto, and the moist air and clouds dematerializing the mountains as he shows us with loose brushstrokes above. On a later trip in 1888, he articulated other troubles with being around too many other painters and their opinions. Quote, "All these folks here, the painters, are idiots who had indicated with their stupid point of view the least good locations. And voila, this morning, listening only to my instinct, I discovered superb things," end quote. He actually seemed both irritated and a bit self-conscious about the other artists around him in Antibes. Quote, "For them, I am a curious beast to view up close, and they all want to see what I do, doubtless in order to ridicule me," end quote. But Monet does end up painting many of the same vistas that other artists, painters as well as advertisers, did, like the view of the fort. It wasn't just the other people that presented a challenge to Monet's artistic pursuits in the South. The atmosphere was a formidable rival as well. He wrote to his sculptor friend, Auguste Rodin, quote, "I joust and fight with the sun, and what sun there is here. You have to paint here with gold and gemstones. It's amazing," end quote. To another recipient, he confessed, quote, "Surrounded by this dazzling light, one's palette seems quite impoverished," end quote. For me, Monet's paintings convincingly recreate the visual sensation of bright sunlight, making architectural detail hard to discern. Quote, "Surrounded by the fairy-like air," Monet claimed, "what I bring back from here will be pure, gentle sweetness," end quote. Time and again, Monet described the pinks and blues, the sweetness of the atmosphere, as otherworldly, and his canvases with their marvelous play of soft colors and vibrant light convey that. But for some of his peers, including Pissarro and Degas, the paintings were too pretty and too commercial when they were exhibited by Theo van Gogh, Vincent's brother, who was then working for Boussat and Valadon Gallery and took on 10 of Monet's paintings from the South. If you will permit me a little chronological backtrack, I want to stop on a different coastline, that of Normandy, to address two other aspects of Monet's painterly practice that I find helpful before looking forward to his series paintings. In these paintings from the early 1880s, we encounter Monet's fascinating iteration across chronology with Fisherman's Cottage and a viewpoint informed by Japanese prints with Seacoast at Trouville. What I love about seeing Monet's Seacoast at Trouville alongside Hiroshige's print is the reminder that Monet carries in his mind great works of art that he admires, and those memories, those artworks, shape his experience of the world around him, even if subconsciously. Monet amassed a sizable collection of Japanese woodblock prints and knew others through exhibitions, shops, and publications. While he did not own this particular one, he owned others from this series and others with centrally located trees. I can imagine him scouting along the Normandy coast for where to place his easel and being so pleased with this little tree and giving it pride of place in the center of the composition. Imagine if he moved his easel 5 feet in either direction. That little tree about to pull out of the ground wouldn't be the star of the show anymore. The painting Gust of Wind, made on the same trip as Seacoast at Trouville, realizes exactly that point. Any of those little trees near the coast toward the left could be the one featured in the MFA's painting. In late summer, probably late August or early September of 1881, Monet made this brief trip to the coast. He needed to absent himself from his domestic situation. It was a complex time in the artist's life. His first wife, Camille, died in 1879, and he and their 2 young sons took up residence with Alice Hochedé, wife of his former patron Ernest, and the 6 Hochedé children. Finances were dire, Ernest Hochedé having gone bankrupt and auctioned off his collection, Monet bartering paintings to his landlord to cover overdue rent. And a liaison that would become marriage after Ernest's death developed between Monet and Alice Hochedé. He made these 4 paintings on that 1881 trip to the coast, at the end of which he wrote to his dealer when he got back home, quote, "Here I am back in Vetoy, the persistent bad weather having prevented me from doing any kind of work. It was necessary for me to return, and to return empty-handed," end quote. So he says he's empty-handed, but he made 4 paintings, or at least started them, on that trip. About 8 months later, he exhibited the MFA's Seacoast at Trouville in the 7th Impressionist exhibition. So he went from empty-handed, his words, to exhibition ready. Either he was being dismissive of his accomplishments to avoid raising his dealer's expectations, or he worked this up to exhibitable finish after leaving the coast. In another of the paintings from that trip, you may notice a little building tucked into the coastline. These former customs outposts had, in many cases, been repurposed to storage shelters for fishermen and their gear, and they appear in various places along the coastline and in the course of Monet's art. He had painted one near his aunt's home in Saint-Adresse over a decade earlier, in 1867. Normandy's coast was repeatedly the focus of Monet's paintings in the late 1860s and into the first years of the 1870s. Then there was a break in his seaside sojourns for much of the decade, while his life, professionally and personally, was focused along the Seine, in Paris and its surroundings. When he returned to the Normandy coast, he revisited many locales that had occupied him nearly a decade earlier, creating new works that harken back to old ones. While we perhaps think of the 8 independent exhibitions of the Impressionists as showcasing the newest art, the artists also included paintings they'd finished years prior, like the Hut at Saint-Adresse, which was painted in 1867 and included in the 1877 Impressionist exhibition. When Monet asked owners of some of his earlier paintings to lend them to later exhibitions, like that 3rd Impressionist exhibition in 1877, Monet indicated he wanted to borrow them back for exhibition because, quote, "I see the advantage there would be for me in showing different aspects of myself," end quote. Again, in the group's next exhibition, the 4th Impressionist exhibition in 1879, there was something of a Monet retrospective featuring works from across the previous decade of his painterly career. As Monet revisited old stomping grounds along the Normandy coast and old canvases for exhibition and for sale, those subjects and compositions recurred in new works as well. The artist seemed to be looking forward and back, into nature and into his memory. The 1867 hut at Saint-Adresse was among those exhibited in 1877's Impressionist exhibition, but also in Monet's solo show at La Vie Moderne in 1880, and somewhat later in 1889 at a joint exhibition with Auguste Rodin at Galerie Georges Petit. Variations on the distinctive composition with an extremely steep elevated viewpoint and a modest building punctuating the coastline reappeared in Trouville in 1881, and extensively the following year in more than 10 paintings, including 4 featuring the particular building found in the MFA's Fisherman's Cottage on the cliffs at Varengeville, and similar buildings elsewhere along the coastline as well. Coming back to that 1882 exhibition, the 7th Impressionist exhibition, where Monet's Seacoast at Trouville was first displayed, critic Ernest Chesneau beautifully recognized the challenge and triumph of Monet's negotiation of immediacy and memory, noting sagely that, quote, the fundamentally variable phenomena of light and atmosphere pass, leaving only an impression on our retina and in our memory, a memory of the enchantment of color and movement. That is what the painters aptly named Impressionists aspire to and succeed in rendering for us. It is the memory that they wish to and know how to fix. What eyes sensitive to these ephemeral celebrations of coloration and motion, to these wonders of light that play on the surface of our terrestrial globe, would not be grateful to them, end quote. Monet valued Chesneau's review, and while the critic may only have intended memory as a matter of moments, the duration from visual stimulus to selection of pigment to moving a brush across the canvas, the celebration of Monet's paintings as an achievement of memory resonates more broadly. It was also around this time, in 1882, that Monet started to write more regularly in his letters about his studio practice, including the wish to see all of his works from a painting trip together in his studio before releasing them to his dealer, Paul Durand Ruel. Monet would return again to these coastal locales 15 years later, in 1896 and 97, to create more related works, again reprising familiar compositions, including at least 4 featuring the cottage at Varengeville. These were shown, along with his Morning on the Seine series, at Galerie Georges Petit in 1898. The cottage paintings, like the later grain stacks, repeat a motif and some compositional elements, without being as much the same in their composition as the Morning on the Seine series or the Rouen Cathedral series, or even the Lily Pond and Water Lilies. The cottage paintings hint at seriality, but extend across a wide 30-year chronology of Monet's career. Over the course of a much more concentrated period, in 1890 and 1891, Monet painted some 30 canvases of grain stacks, some with 1 stack, others with 2. This was his first true series, his first concentrated and repeated engagement with a single motif. But we should recall that working in an iterative fashion was not new to Monet, whether it was the fort at Antibes up close and from afar, the cottages along the Normandy coastline, or the famed suite of paintings of the Saint-Lazare train station. To paint his first true series, Monet turned his attention to a small field called Le Clomoran to the west of his home in Giverny, where harvested grain was constructed into stacks and stored. Seeing many of them at once, you can really get a sense for the changing weather conditions of the seasons and changing light effects of differing times of year and times of day. They're so familiar to us now that it might seem inevitable. So I really love to see the MFA's painting alongside a postcard from 1900 showing the same small field. There are the distinctive grain stacks built to protect the harvest from moisture and rodents. They're usually about 15 to 20 feet high. Some scholars thinking about Monet's work focus on the idea that such stacks represent the source of wealth for the people of the region and prosperity and security of a nation, an idea of France identifying itself as an agrarian country, and this is part of its breadbasket. This field is just a stone's throw from Monet's house, and I like seeing the MFA's painting alongside a photograph of that field because for me it highlights Monet's choices, the way he placed his easel in this field and framed his composition on canvas. I think it also helps in understanding that although these paintings look quite simple and peaceful, Monet found this work to be an enormous challenge. In 1890, as Monet worked on the grainstack paintings, he wrote to his friend Gustav quote, "I'm in a very foul mood and profoundly disgusted with painting. It really is continual torture. Don't expect to see anything new. The little I did manage to do has been destroyed, scraped off, or torn up. You've no idea what appalling weather we've had continually these past 2 months. When you're trying to convey the weather, the atmosphere, and the general mood, it's enough to make you mad with rage," end quote. In case you think that was just one particularly rough day, here's another example. Again, writing to Gustave Geoffroy, quote, "I'm hard at it, working stubbornly on a series of different effects, grain stacks. But at this time of year, the sun sets so fast, it's impossible to keep up with it. I'm getting so slow at my work, it makes me despair. But the further I get, the more I see a lot of work has to be done in order to render what I'm looking for. Instantaneity, the envelope above all, the same light spread over everything. And more than ever, I'm disgusted by easy things that come in one go. Anyway, I'm increasingly obsessed by the need to render what I experience, and I'm praying that I'll have a few more good years left to me because I think I may make some progress in that direction," end quote. Monet describes his goal in these paintings. He wants to convey what he sees, the weather and atmosphere, but also the mood, the feeling of the experience of being there. He's frustrated by the challenge of keeping up with it all and conveying it all, though that isn't the frustration he's aiming to bring through into our encounter with the finished works. He scraped and tore and destroyed those. He needed to work through that aggravation, scraping down canvases and tearing them up before achieving his goals. His quest proved both inspiring and profitable. Monet exhibited 15 grainstack paintings, including the MFAs, at the gallery of his dealer, Durand Ruel, in May 1891, to critical acclaim and commercial success. He spent the rest of his career painting primarily in series. That same friend who received those frustrated letters from Monet was the one who wrote the essay in the exhibition's pamphlet in 1891. The show was so widely heralded that the essay was reprinted in a major art journal for broader distribution. Given that this is written by a friend, and by a friend with whom Monet shared his thoughts while working on the series, I think it's particularly interesting to quote at length. From what he had learned from the painter and what he saw in the works, Gustave Geoffroy wrote, quote, "The grouping together of 15 canvases of grainstacks, each representing the same subject with a rendition of the same landscape, is an extraordinarily victorious artistic demonstration. For his part, Claude Monet has been able to substantiate the continuous appearance in new aspects of immutable objects, the uninterrupted flood of changing and interrelated sensations apparent in the face of a changeless spectacle. He substantiates the possibility of summing up the poetry of the universe within a circumscribed space," end quote. I love the way Geoffroy articulates this notion that the proximate and particular evokes the broad and expansive, as discussed earlier in this talk as well. Geoffroy continued, quote, "He knows that an artist can spend his life in the same place without exhausting the possibilities of the constantly renewed scene around him," end quote. It is such a potential lesson for us to encourage us to see endless possibilities all around ourselves. Geoffroy extended the analysis of Monet's grain stacks to his oeuvre in general. Quote, the same message conveyed by the light in the grain stack landscapes is transmitted in other canvases. He is always the incomparable painter of earth and sky, preoccupied with fleeting light conditions on the permanent background of the universe, end quote. This is indeed one way of thinking about Monet's achievement, his ability to balance the stable and the fleeting in his art. Among American critics was Cecilia Warren, who lauded the charms of these paintings in a publication called Atlantic Monthly. She said, quote, most wonderful of all is the way in which the painter manages, by mere pigments put on canvas, to make you feel all the heat and harmony and happiness of summer, end quote. In addition to critics, artists also responded to these works. The artist Theodore Robinson wrote from Giverny on June 9th of 1891 to the Bostonian Thomas Perry, recommending that he see Monet's recent work, and I quote, it is colossal, something, the same grave, almost religious feeling there often is in Millet, with at the same time the charm of realism. To me, they are a little finer than any of his previous work, end quote. It is satisfying to be reminded that Monet wasn't the first to take on these temporary structures as the subject of a painting. There is something reverential in the quietude and grandeur of Monet's portrayal of the grain stack, perhaps creating the kinship Robinson perceived between the atmosphere of these paintings and the dignity Millet gave to scenes of rural land and work. Of course, not everyone was unreserved in their admiration. Pissarro wrote with regard to the grain stacks at Durand Ruel's gallery, quote, it's hard to put one's finger on it. If I were to find fault, it would be more to do with a question of accuracy or one of harmony rather than of unity of execution, end quote. He just couldn't reconcile himself to it. Quote, nothing but grain stacks. I do not know to what extent Monet must be annoyed by being tied to this sort of repetition. These are the awful effects of success, end quote. But Pissarro did feel that, quote, these canvases breathe contentment, end quote, which is perhaps a bit funny given what we know about how hard these paintings had been for the artist to achieve. But perhaps it's also a testament to Monet achieving his goal of rendering the whole sensation the complete envelope of the experience. More than a decade later, in 1905, a photograph of the grain stacks in the Clomoran appeared in an article about Monet and his work. I'm fond of this photograph because we can get a sense for his fame and for how closely this form, this motif of the grain stack, came to be associated with him, even 15 years or so after he painted the series of grain stacks, to say nothing of now, more than a century later. While working on the grain stack series, Monet bought his home in Giverny, and in 1893, he also purchased land across a small road and railroad tracks from his house to make something, as Monet described it himself, quote, for the purpose of cultivating aquatic plants and also for the pleasure of the eye and for motifs to paint, end quote. The MFA's painting, Water Lily Pond, shows a structure and space in Monet's home garden constructed based upon Japanese prints he admired. The footbridge spanned the lily pond at its narrowest point. You may recall Monet's love of flowers and of gardening as described earlier in this talk. After buying his home and the adjacent property in Giverny, he ripped out the vegetable garden to plant flower beds near the house, and he sought permission from local authorities to reroute water from the river to create a still pond for water lilies. These spaces would become the focus of his artistic energies through the final decades of his career. Although he planted this area by 1895, he didn't paint it in earnest for almost 5 years, during which time the foliage grew in around it. In 1899, once the garden had matured, Monet started work on a series of 17 views under different lighting conditions. Seeing others from the group reminds us of the range of color palettes and the subtle shift in viewpoints from the bridge nearly centrally located across the composition to a shifted angle with which Monet depicted this scene. For me, in the MFA's painting, there's a fascinating play of reality and reflection, where the foliage itself ends and meets its reflection on the water's surface, and the wonderful visual commingling of the object and its reflection. Monet doesn't simplify this or make it easier for us to tell them apart. He allows this harmony and open-endedness. The first suite he painted of the garden focused on the bridge and took in trees and reeds along the water's edge, but the artist soon turned his attention onto the pond's surface. In 1909, Monet exhibited 48 of his water lilies, including the MFAs, at the gallery of his Paris dealer, Paul de Rondruel. Monet called them water landscapes. As Monet said, quote, "I painted a lot of nymphea, each time modifying my point of view, renewing the motif with the seasons and according to the effects of light caused by these changes. The effect changes incessantly, not only from one season to the next, but minute by minute, because the lilies are not the spectacle, they are only the accompaniment," end quote. The descriptive title, Water Landscapes, perhaps aligns better with Monet's assessment than the currently employed title of Water Lilies. In an interview for this 1909 exhibition, Monet told the journalist, Roger Marks, quote, "I set up my easel in front of this body of water that adds a pleasant freshness to my garden. Its circumference is less than 200 meters. Looking at it, you thought of infinity. You were able to discern in it, as in a microcosm, the presence of the elements and the instability of a universe that changes constantly under our very eyes," end quote. Each canvas evokes specific conditions of light and weather, as he described. But there's a tension between this specificity and something less fixed. As he put it, quote, "The indeterminate and the vague are modes of expression that have a reason for existing and have their own characteristics. Through them, sensations become lasting," end quote. The tension between definite and vague, specific and general, aids in creating something fascinating to look at over and over again. This glimpse of a portion of the pond within his garden suggests a world beyond the limits of the canvas and beyond even the confines of the garden in Giverny. Response was overwhelmingly enthusiastic to Monet's exhibition of the water lilies. Many critics noted how far Monet, the 68-year-old artist, had pushed himself beyond his previous work, and thus how novel his new pictures appeared. Here's Jean Morgan writing for Le Gaulois in 1909. Quote, "His vision increasingly is simplifying itself, limiting itself to the minimum of tangible realities in order to amplify, to magnify the impression of the imponderable. Water invades the entire canvas, becoming the fluid field upon which the mysterious blossoms of the water lilies open out. The air and the water intermingle in a single light mist that absorbs each element, including the impalpable golden dust of the invisible sun," end quote. Roger Marks, writing for the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, likewise was awestruck, and I quote, "No more earth, no more sky, no limits now. The dormant and fertile waters completely cover the field of the canvas. Light overflows. Here, the painter deliberately broke away from the teachings of Western tradition by not seeking pyramidal lines or a single point of focus. Through the incense of soft vapors, under a light veil of silvery mist, the indecisive meets the precise. Certainty becomes conjecture, and the enigma of mystery opens the mind to the world of illusion and the infinity of dreams." End quote. In all of this, I'm reminded of Monet's restless creativity and of the compelling contradictions in his own words and those of his peers to describe his art, and perhaps in our own experience of his work, of the general and the specific, the momentary and the universal, the tangible and the ethereal. It calls to mind poet Charles Baudelaire's words from The Painter of Modern Life, wherein he wrote of, quote, "the passing moment and all the suggestions of eternity that it contains," end quote, which so poetically captures that tension between the immediate and the eternal that characterized modern art for Baudelaire, and is perhaps at the heart of what makes Monet's landscapes, Monet's places, so endlessly captivating.